Today on the Self Smarter podcast.
There's a great paradox around vulnerability that I've learned, seen firsthand, felt firsthand, is that we look for vulnerabilities now in leaders. Like we see it as a strength, whether it's a leader, an athlete, or maybe someone in our personal life that stands up and says, maybe it's someone who's fought an illness and stands up and shares their story, or someone who's experienced great grief or success. Even we look for it in others, but when we look ourselves in the mirror, we run from it. Hi, we're Danelle and Megan, the hosts of this conversation-centric podcast for leaders seeking to be better every day. Whether you choose to be a leader in the workplace, at home, or in your community, we believe the most effective leaders are equipped to not only be self-starters, but self-smarter.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
For those of you listening, thank you for coming back, or thank you for being here the first time. I am Megan with a fully recovered voice this week. I've been sick and now this voice is back. And this is Danelle and her always radio voice.
Always radio voice, yes.
She's got the sexy radio voice. Today, we're going to talk about vulnerability. And this is a topic that we've been studying for a while, really.
A long time.
Yeah.
Long time, yeah.
And recently, we've learned that this is something that makes folks a little uncomfortable sometimes.
Oh, yeah, flat out makes us squirm.
Yeah, and especially when you, Danelle, happen to be vulnerable, it makes people squirm. Speaking of vulnerable.
Yes. Yeah, okay.
So we just got back from a 4-long day business trip.
Yes, we did.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And when we do this, there's a lot of fun.
Yeah, lots.
We like to have fun.
Work hard, play hard.
Work hard, play hard is what we do well.
Very well.
Yes. And everybody was very excited to see one another.
Yes. For a lot of people, this was their first show in 2 years. So I would say for the majority of people that could be the case.
Yeah, you coop up a bunch of people who like to have a good time for 2 years, and then you turn them loose.
Yeah, there's some
in a place
instances.
like Disney World or, some place.
Right.
And things can get a little funky.
Yeah, they can get a little out of hand.
Yeah, a little weird.
Mm-hmm.
So you could say there was cocktailing, happening at this event.
Yes.
Would that be true? Okay. Well, I would just like to start this vulnerability conversation with a moment of vulnerability that I witnessed.
Okay.
Not necessarily me or you.
No.
But I felt the vulnerability coming from this person.
Okay.
Because you and I had a fun night.
We did.
Yes, we had a lovely evening. And I carried on the evening. You decided you were going to retire for the evening and be a good girl.
Well, look at me. After 50 years, I finally figured it out how to feel good the next day.
Yes, going to bed and sleep and resting is a good thing. I don't know why I didn't go to bed, but I continued to join the fun with all the other cooped up people.
Well, there's a lot of people that want to celebrate you, and you've had some big news come your way lately, and the newly named president of the company. So you wanted to
It's very nice.
soak in some of the celebration. I get it.
I did.
Yeah.
I sure did.
It was much earned. Yes.
Now this what I'm about to say, he was not celebrating me. Okay. So what happened was Danelle and I go our separate ways. I go to the bar. There's a gentleman in this particular bar.
This is a large bar, just to give everybody a picture. Very
a nice, large bar in Florida. And so there's like trees, I think, in there.
Well, it's a lobby
Yeah,
bar.
it's like a lobby bar.
Yes.
But there's lots of little seating areas for people to have fun with one another.
Well,
There's the bar. And then, like, if I want to sit down and have a conversation,
Sure.
I can do that on these couches or these little stools.
Thanks for that clarification, but yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm just trying to paint a visual so that people can get this in their mind about what I'm about to explain. So Danelle's good night, and then I go towards the bar. Well, I'm with other folks that I know very well in the industry, and so we come across one of these couches that are typically, I think we had a meeting there earlier in the day.
Okay.
But this gentleman in a very vulnerable state has decided to take up residency on this couch for the night for a little sleepy.
Oh, I haven't heard this story. Okay. Yes. So residency.
Meaning, like, I don't know that he's going to leave the couch until who knows when. It could be early in the morning.
So he's taking a dirt nap.
Yes.
In the middle of a very loud lobby.
Yes.
Oh.
Like the party is happening. This is maybe 12:30.
Right.
Okay. at night.
Mm-hmm.
Too damn early
I'd say
to be curling up in a ball on a couch in the middle of a lobby bar to go to sleep. So
I would agree that that's not self-smarter. Yeah, for sure. But that's another episode we can dive into.
Or is it, depending on your state in the moment? See, that's the question. That's the vulnerable part.
Okay. Well,
Maybe it was smarter for him to decide, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I think I'm going to go curl up on that couch in the middle of all these hundreds of people
okay.
and go to sleep. Take off my shoes. Did I mention he was barefoot?
Okay, now see that changes the game. That was now he's being intentional about his dirt nap in the middle of the lobby.
Yes. And to me, it took so much bravery.
And did we know him?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. I asked multiple people.
Okay, do we know this gentleman?
We know this gentleman. I want to make sure he gets home okay. And then I started thinking, you know what? He's going to be fine. He's going to be just fine. He's going to wake up at some point. I hope his shoes are still there. I do. I hope nobody needed those loafers.
Okay.
But I just wondered, and I thought how vulnerable it would be to wake up if I'm him the next morning and I wake up, like the yawn.
Yeah.
And look around and be like, oh, Lord of mercy, I spent the night here, didn't I? I sure did.
I sure did.
Meanwhile, all these people are walking by,
Oh, no.
you know, dressed
Right.
to the nines, ready for their day. And this dude's waking up on the couch. I just thought I've not seen that. In my adult business life, I've never seen a sleepy time in the middle of a happy hour bar like that, like a curled up. This is it.
Take
Where's
off
my
his shoes.
blanket?
Yeah. Yeah.
Does anybody have some floss kind of situation?
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think I have either. I've definitely seen some folks need to take a little nappy here and there.
Well, that happens.
Yeah, that
We
happens.
all have our bad moments, but to curl up in a ball,
Okay.
it was fun. It was fun to see.
So it's a good visual for vulnerability.
It is. Yeah.
How to just lean into it.
Just go right there.
Just go for it. All right.
Yeah, he was super vulnerable and trusted all of us, especially with those loafers. So let's dive in.
Wow. Well, thanks. That's a great way to tee up this lovely topic of ours today.
Yes. And anybody who was with me at the time, y'all know exactly who I'm talking about and what I'm talking about. And it was super fun. And thank you for celebrating
I am
with me.
so disappointed I went to bed early. I would love to have seen that.
I know. It would have been fun. It really would have. So let's dive right into vulnerability.
Okay.
Why don't you start with defining what vulnerability is for all of us?
Okay. What I've learned through the study, it's an interesting word that has vast meanings or uses. And I've been so focused in on one particular type of vulnerability for the last few years that I really haven't thought about it being used in others. But if you Google vulnerability, I mean, you'll find topics from disaster preparation to security to societal vulnerabilities and all the way into emotional, which is where we've been focused. But it's just an interesting word. But if you literally look in the dictionary, so if you look Oxford's definition, it's the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. So Merriam-Webster says it's capable of being physically or emotionally wounded, open to attack or damage. And when I think about that, it's like, whoa, vulnerability it has some weight to it. And I've known that definitely from an emotional standpoint, but I guess just looking at the basic definition of the word, it does have so many uses and how vulnerability is being applied. And if you do think of disaster preparation, like I get it. And, societal vulnerabilities that's heavy stuff. And so I don't know why I didn't think of it being described that way. Like it stood out to me. So I just thought that was interesting as I was preparing for this particular episode. And so the definition of vulnerability that we've used to kind of guide our relationship with this particular emotion is obviously from Brene Brown, which is not going to be a surprise to anyone who's listened to either one or two of our episodes. But Brene says that vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. But vulnerability is not weakness. In fact, it's our greatest measure of courage. She also says that vulnerability sounds like the truth and it feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they're never a weakness. She says that vulnerability is not about winning or losing. It's about having the courage to show up even when you cannot control the outcome. And it's also, vulnerability is also not knowing victory or defeat. It's understanding the necessity of both. It's engaging, it's being all in. And I would say I have so many very specific examples of each one of those ways that she describes vulnerability, especially not knowing victory or defeat, but understanding the necessity of both. I think we've been presented with that reality so many times. So I certainly love those definitions of vulnerability from Brene. And that's obviously what's shaped a lot for us.
And the one about it's having courage to show up when you can't control the outcome really makes me think a lot about this podcast. I mean, we've been studying vulnerability for years, and starting this podcast was arguably one of the more vulnerable things you've done in your career. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, the podcast for sure. Well, the actual starting of the podcast, I have plenty of talented people around, so I wouldn't say that piece of it, but the genesis for why I wanted to do it really came from the fact that 8 years ago, I received a crappy 26% approval rating as a leader. I mean, the rating wasn't crappy because it came from the people who were needing to tell me. But the fact is it was an approval rating that I was not okay with as a leader. And when I think about vulnerability, Brene also teaches us that we need to own our own story and love ourselves through the process. And when we do that, it's the bravest thing that we can do. So when I started to think about how that particular part of my story could end up helping other people, I saw vulnerability in a different light. I really started to believe her that vulnerability is courage. And I started to see it as being something that, was beyond. And she said, beyond just expressing yourself. Right. I saw it as being almost an act of service. And she says that only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we fully discover the infinite power of our light. And I don't even know whether this is episode 9. And because we had just gone to that show and we have the 9 weeks underneath our belt, I see that to be the case. I see that in being vulnerable enough 8 years ago to do something about that approval rating and becoming a better version of myself. And then also now deciding to share it with you, with our listeners, on this in a weekly format. I do see the light of it all. And even though it still can be difficult talking about some of the aspects of the journey. So, yeah.
And I think people are in awe of it. In fact, on this trip that we just got back from, you got a lot of comments and a lot of different perspectives coming at you for those days while we were gone.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about that. I mean, you had published an article.
Right.
And you had talked about your personal growth journey and that vulnerability was a big part of that story.
Yes.
And what are some of that's a good example of something where people were really, I don't want to use triggered, but like interested more in finding out your story and why you're comfortable with that. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think people that either read the article and or had begun listening to the podcast. And it was interesting. I got a lot of thank yous. I got a lot of atta girls, if you will. Thank you for showing up in that way. And, all things that I certainly appreciate that, we've been receiving since we've launched this podcast. But I did get some interesting, responses relative to, like, why would you do that? Yeah. Like, why would you knowingly share with this, we serve niche
an audience.
Yeah. And, people know you, people, know a lot about you in terms of, your journey, your leadership journey, or the company. Why would you expose that piece of it so openly and willingly? And I wasn't expecting that question, I think, because I've just been so committed to it for so long that there would still be a question mark as to why that would be important to do.
Or like that it's wrong in some way.
And I don't think that was the intention behind it, but it was just like really questioning why someone would knowingly put that out there. And I think that's when I realized how important, this type of work is, this podcast. And it's a good reminder that, wait a minute, I wasn't always comfortable with it.
Right.
I carried the armor and I had to learn to get comfortable with it. So if someone's questioning why I would, potentially this could be of help to them.
That's right.
The conversations that we're having. And, you know, I'm not sure about the conversation about someone in the lobby bar. Hopefully that will help them not take a dirt nap, you know, during cocktail hour.
Right.
But I do think that I think the response is probably where I was 8 years ago. I think I might have asked someone the exact same question, not understanding why they would be willing to share such a vulnerable experience and continue to do it on a regular basis.
How do you, so you, in your learning about vulnerability and on your path, what are some ways that people show up in terms of their vulnerability? I mean, vulnerability looks different for everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what has inspired you?
Well, one of the ways I like to think about, or that I've learned that we all have different perspectives about what vulnerability is that it, again, at the end of, or to bring up Brene again, which we will several more times today, is that at the end of her Dare to Lead podcast, she asked all of her guests a series of questions. And one of the questions is finish this sentence. Vulnerability is. And so I just went and found, or re-listened and found some of my favorites. And so James Clear, one of our favorite authors, wrote Atomic Habits. He says, vulnerability is the acceptance of imperfection. America Ferrera, how do you say her name? Ferrera, the actor, she says vulnerability is power. Charles Feldman, we talked about him extensively in episode 4, writing the Thin Book of Trust. He's, of course, says vulnerability is trust, which is not ironic. Yes. And President Barack Obama said that vulnerability is inevitable. Be open to it, which I thought was an interesting way to think about vulnerability. Abby Wambach, one of our faves, obviously world-class soccer player and wife to Glennon, is vulnerability is matching your insides with your outsides, which absolutely love that. But my favorite of all of these particular series is from Simon Sinek, surprise, surprise. And he says that vulnerability is giving someone the power to destroy you and trusting that they won't use it.
Yeah, that's intense.
Yeah.
It's so true.
But it is a good reminder that you're opening yourself up for, and destroy is a drastic word, but to potentially make fun of you, to potentially call you out, which I definitely have been called out for the story that I'm sharing with people. And some of it has been with good intention. And I would say I've had a few, very few with ill intent, but overall it's been, definitely not, it's been something that I think people are just curious about and want to understand it more. But I loved the fact that all these different people, and again, I just took a small sample from her podcast, but there was not one that was even remotely the same. So vulnerability, it means different things to different people, which is something that we need to be conscious of, because what is vulnerable to me is definitely not vulnerable to you. And there's a lot that goes into it, a lot of how we're wired. So think about the different Enneagram types. And, we've talked about that on a previous episode, that the way I show up with vulnerability is different than the way you show up with it. So it's, keeping that in mind is definitely helpful when we're thinking about this emotion, that when we become better at it, good things happen. I know that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about today.
Yeah, absolutely. And with a definition like the Oxford definition and the Merriam-Webster definitions that you read earlier, it makes, obviously it's something that is, it's not a taboo topic, but it's something that we should be above, right? I think traditionally vulnerability is something you should rise above and
conquer.
Yeah. Conquer. Perfect.
Prepare for, because the other side of a lot of the vulnerability teachings is if you're prepared, you can avoid it.
Right.
Whereas the emotional vulnerability as an emotion is the opposite. It's leaning into it.
Leaning in.
Yeah.
Right. So then when you think about barriers, people's barriers, why wouldn't anybody want to be vulnerable? Why aren't people more vulnerable?
Again, in Daring Greatly, Brene Brown gives us, she outlines different barriers, and we'll put them in the show notes. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I picked out a few, and I think these are the ones that I know that we as an organization, and quite frankly, me personally, that needed the most work for this organization to get to a place to where we have a healthy culture today. And those barriers are avoiding tough conversations. It's probably top of our list, and we're going to be doing an episode on that next, where we're going to talk about conflict. But avoiding tough conversations, we realized that at our organization we could be talking about people and not to people.
Right.
Now, talking about you shouldn't always frame it as being gossip.
Right.
But talking about something without talking to the person.
Right.
We did that because we were avoiding conflict and, the tough conversations. And so that's a barrier to vulnerability. Another one is not tending to fears and feelings. And so that's like, and I think we've actually probably had this a lot in our organization. Not probably, we did, is that, the workplace isn't a place for feelings. And even though we cared about each other, we could have feelings toward each other, maybe cheer each other on personally. But when it came to work, we were here to get the job done. And so having emotions and feelings here, we would try to manage or navigate it versus just allow it to celebrate it, quite frankly. So that was another barrier that we personally faced. I would say the Ghazi values, and we talked a lot about that in episode 2 and 3, is, our values don't align with observable behaviors. Mm-hmm. And so what does that look like in terms of a barrier to vulnerability is without very specific values and, in an understanding, there's no way to be truly vulnerable because you don't know what the values of the organization are. So you are unclear about how to show up on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. And so there's not a lot of room for vulnerability when you don't have that guidance.
That's right.
And then I would say another area is perfectionism. And by trying to do everything perfectly, perfection and vulnerability, there's no room for vulnerability and perfectionism. And so I think that's the obvious barrier to vulnerability is certainly that. Again, there's other ones in terms of stuck in setbacks where we can't get out of a setback because we can't believe that we got stuck. And so we just sit there and mull in it, and we can't get past it. We can't see the learning in it. Those are some of the other barriers that stand out relative to let's just be vulnerable. We didn't nail that. We could be better at it. Let's turn this into a lesson and let's move this forward. So those are some that I definitely think are worth taking note of. Again, we'll put them all in the show notes.
I think what's really surfacing is that folks are uncomfortable with being comfortable with vulnerability just yet. I think we're on the cusp of change, and we can thank Brené Brown for that.
She's led the charge for sure.
And it's all rooted in shame, which she has a wonderful TEDx about. And that really was the catalyst to her being such a huge inspiration for so many people in this regard. Mm-hmm. But what we feel is that when you practice it as practitioners of vulnerability, that it really can be freeing. It will set you free.
Absolutely.
Emotionally, just so mental health wise, we're all on the same playing field, and we can all just be ourselves, really is what it is. And so I think a lot of folks tell themselves myths to keep them from being vulnerable.
Yeah, I think we tell ourselves myths, but I think we've also been taught it too.
Yeah.
Because I think that, I think previous generations, and again, not pointing fingers, there's reasons why vulnerability was not accepted. You think about the folks that came out of the Great Depression.
Right.
You're trying to escape societal vulnerabilities.
That's right.
There's not a lot of room for emotional vulnerabilities at that point. And if I think about us going through wars and thinking about different things. I get it. Like, I understand if historically you look, I understand why we have a deficit around this particular emotion. It makes sense to me. But what doesn't make sense to me is that now that we have the tools and the context is continuing to ignore it. And that's something that I just wasn't willing to do, certainly on a professional level here at this company, but also from a personal standpoint. And so I think the myths around vulnerability, if you think about, and I mentioned it earlier, but vulnerability is a weakness. I think we've thought of it as being something that we should be ashamed of, that we're vulnerable in a moment. But it's interesting because there's a great paradox around vulnerability that I've learned, seen firsthand, felt firsthand, is that we look for vulnerabilities now in leaders. Like we see it as a strength, whether it's a leader, an athlete, or maybe someone in our personal life that stands up and says, maybe it's someone who's fought an illness and stands up and shares their story, or someone who's experienced great, grief or success even. We look for it in others, but when we look ourselves in the mirror, we run from it. And that's certainly something that I was experiencing prior to this, this approval rating. Was I was carrying so much armor. But when I think back on it, of course I respected the people who could show up and express themselves or share their less than perfect journey, but I wasn't willing to do it myself in that moment. And I was that's something that really stood out to me. So vulnerability is a weakness, but the fact is as we all know now, it's one of our greatest marketers of courage. So I think another myth is that I don't do vulnerability. And I think people think sometimes that vulnerability, and it's certainly the way we've been describing mine, is in this huge moment, this watershed moment where I ran smack dab into a wall, or maybe I was clubbed, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. It felt the same. Is that vulnerability doesn't have to be in these extremely large, over emotional moments. It can be in these everyday moments, like showing up to a meeting for the first time, presenting, or showing up to a meeting with a client for the first time. There's a bit of a vulnerable moment there. So I think we have to see it in all of its ways and start before we can really start to understand our relationship with it. So sometimes it's easier to find it in the smaller moments than sit around and wait for some big moment. And so I think, and I always think about this with my daughter, who we've mentioned and will continue to mention many times. My daughter Mackie is pursuing a degree in musical theater, and it was obvious to see her vulnerable moments when she would go out for an audition. But what we tried to talk about is start to really work on the vulnerable moments of when you're just singing a song that for maybe just your family for the first time, because there's still a tinge of it. Even though she's completely comfortable with us, she has not sang that song before. And maybe she's practiced in her room, but looking at someone singing a song. So what I'm saying is, I think what we need to do is we don't need to put it, the myth is that it has to be this big thing. It really can. Vulnerability happens every single day.
Right. It can show up in small moments.
Small moments. And I think that's help. If we can understand that, it can help us see vulnerability in a much different light. I think some of the other myths are, vulnerability means full disclosure. Mm-hmm. No. We do not necessarily, leaders, I know leaders struggle with this. I know some of our leaders here who struggle with how vulnerable do I need to be? And it's, sometimes vulnerability can be leaning into what you don't know and admitting it. It doesn't necessarily mean tell every aspect of everything about you. It can be, I don't know in this particular instance what the answer to that question is, but let's figure it out together. Vulnerability can show up relative to the questions you ask, to how well you listen. And so I think the myth is, I see that I have to show up and tell everything. No, we don't need that. We have enough of that going on out in the world on social media and, every news outlet out there. So that's a myth that I think we need to squash around vulnerability. It doesn't mean full disclosure. And then I think the other one is that trust comes before vulnerability. And that's a myth that definitely has come out in some of Brené's research. And the truth is we need to flip that statement around, that vulnerability actually precedes trust. You have to have it in order to earn it, meaning you have to have vulnerability in order to earn trust. And, you know, Brené's quote on that is, vulnerability is about sharing our feelings and our experiences with people who have earned the right to hear them. So sharing our experiences with someone who's earned the right to hear them. And I like that statement because I think of when you're being vulnerable in a one-on-one situation or in a smaller group, that is helpful to think about, wait a minute, these people, they've earned the right to hear this about me. And that's the, you know, a basis for forming trust. And we have a whole episode where we talk about how to foster trust, and vulnerability is, of course, part of that journey. So I do like the idea of flipping that myth, where I think a lot of people think you have to trust someone before you're vulnerable with them. And that's not the case.
In terms of business, you know, there's an element to vulnerability that equates to risk taking. And so vulnerability can show up in an emotional way, and it can also show up in a business sense in a decision-making way. And I think, you know, you recently shared a quote with me from James Clear, and the quote is, to achieve success, you must be willing to take risks. To take risks, you must be willing to be vulnerable.
Yeah. And then, so read those two sentences again.
To achieve success, you must be willing to take risks. To take risks, you must be willing to be vulnerable.
Right. So therefore, to achieve success, you must be willing to be vulnerable. And I mean, that's it in a nutshell. And so there's a direct correlation between success and vulnerability.
Right.
And once we started to understand that here, again, you can think of vulnerability as being our greatest act of courage, but when you see the correlation of vulnerability to success, like if I don't learn to be more vulnerable, then I'm going to fall short of a lot of the things that I want to achieve, both personally and professionally. So that was huge for me, is to understand that dynamic.
Yeah. And I think from a risk perspective, I've told you, I think I've shared with you for years, that I admire and I believe wholeheartedly you are a conservative CEO with a healthy grasp on risk. And when is appropriate, I've learned a lot from you in terms of when it's an appropriate time to take a risk and when it's not, and what's worth risking and what is not. And so I think a lot of that is rooted in vulnerability. And I don't think we knew that then. We know that now. I realize that
right
now.
No.
So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your perspective and your view of risk and vulnerability as it pertains to business.
I mean, I do think it's true. And I've certainly studied and learned a lot about how to take business risk. And, you know, some of them made me comfortable and some of the risk made me uncomfortable.
Right.
I definitely would say that I skew on the side of risk adverse. I think a lot of people would say that about me relative to business decisions.
Yeah.
But what I learned about myself was that I wasn't good at taking emotional risk.
Okay. Let's talk about emotional risk.
Yeah. So I just, you know, I was avoiding it. And I talk about the armor that I had on me is I didn't know how to honestly go there.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that I needed to go there until you all lovingly let me know that it was that I needed to. And I think that when you're thinking about vulnerability and risk, so let's take apart risk here for a second, is that there's physical risk that we take. And I know we're talking about specific to business right now. So if you think about the physical risk we take, that could be a financial decision.
Yes.
That could be an operational decision. That could literally be a risk taking on a client that we're not exactly sure if we can do the work. I mean, there's aspects of risk. I would consider those, and again, I don't know if the right word is physical, but that in my mind, being the visual person I am, those are physical risk. And then the emotional risk, they're harder to define.
Yeah.
And because they're inside, and you said it earlier, vulnerability and therefore risk, it shows up differently for everyone. Like what may be an emotional risk to me may not be to you. is very different for a 7 on the Enneagram than a 9, and how we show up in different scenarios. So we know that to be true. But I think of emotional risk as, if I'm going to put a visual to it or a description, it's that thing that can gnaw at you. Those things that swirl around in our minds that we can't seem to shake. It's that, it's what happens to you when you know you either want to or need to say something or show up for something, and you're not exactly sure of the outcome, like how it's going to be received. And, exposing it can also show up as exposing your personal ideas or beliefs for people, quite frankly, to judge.
Right.
And I think that at the root of it, that's what we're fearing is, what is the other person or people on the other side of this moment? How am I going to be perceived? How are they going to react? And I think that is where the emotional risk comes. And again, I think when you're thinking about individuals, we see it very differently. And so, because something of value is at stake, it could be our reputation, it could be
our
money. Well, relative to, that to me is on the physical side, but from an emotional standpoint, there's this sense of uncertainty, like I said, over the outcome. And so, because we all show up differently with that, it can vary between person to person. So we have to be conscious of that, and kind of really, as leaders, learn to understand that about ourselves. So when we're vulnerable, what does that feel like? What does that look like? And what are we vulnerable about? Being able to communicate about it, and then being able to show up for, our people and try to understand that about them too. And I would say that because we all show up differently, we analyze things differently, no different than we do on the physical side. So whether it's a business expense, as you said, or any decision that needs to be made, we, as individuals, when we're talking about emotional risk, we end up weighing that. And so what we need to do as leaders is help our people understand that taking those emotional risks is an okay thing to do. And I think that is a conscious, consistent effort on a leader's part, is to create an environment where that is a possibility.
Okay, so you're touching on this sort of scalability of vulnerability within an organization or within a team or a culture. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, what you've learned and ways that people can encourage vulnerability and taking risks within an organization and personally?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to learn how to be more vulnerable. And I think it all comes down to practice.
Yes.
And trusting yourself, and then learning to trust others. And so I think that's the root of being able to show up in a vulnerable way and being able to accept vulnerability from others. But I have picked up on some things along the way, and especially as it relates to the workplace, is that one thing I've learned is that we have to create some boundaries around where risk is acceptable and vulnerability. So if we're, again, back to talking about vulnerability and risk and the correlation between the two, because if we don't create boundaries, we can't just free for all go create risk every single day, especially in the workplace, because, we have to, from a health perspective, if you think about from a financial, from a reputation standpoint, definitely as marketers, we don't want our clients to go, let's just run free and wild. We've got to create some, and it's called the sandbox. One of the authors that I follow, they call it, you've got to create some constraints around what is acceptable and what's not. But I think so many companies and at times in so many relationships, we're so focused on the constraints or the box that we're not good at clearly communicating, well, where is the free space to go create risk? Where can risk take place? Right. And so the sandbox shouldn't be about how small it can be. It just needs to be, here are the areas that we can't cross from a legal standpoint, from a health standpoint, whatever it may be, ethics, you fill in the blanks. I don't have to describe that to our listeners. That's easy to understand. But what it does is once we understand the boundaries, it frees us up to be more creative without concerns, because we know that there's a space that we can go to really think about risk and be vulnerable with those ideas and those, quite frankly, coming up with solutions to hopefully solve the problems for the business. But again, I think so many times we focus on what we can't do versus creating a space for what we can do. Yeah. So I think the other thing is to make it safe. And when I talk about safety, I'm talking about psychological safety. Mm-hmm. Creating a space to where you're not going to be ridiculed or blamed for a particular action or a particular idea, and certainly not punished. So again, creating a space for people to operate where they understand that, their failure could be an option. I mean, it can be. And so I think that doesn't come, creating a safe place, and I've learned this firsthand, is that you don't just say we're safe around here. You create ways for people to see it in small moments. So it's consistent moments of, yes, that idea, you were heard, and that's not an idea that we can execute on, and here's why.
Right.
But let's keep them going. Let's keep going with it. Let's keep moving towards.
Yes.
Because the genesis of what you were saying was not off, but the reality of us being able to execute whatever that idea is right now is not the time. Right. So sometimes the answer is not yes or no. Sometimes it's just not now, or until we do this, that's not possible. And I think we've got to be conscious of creating that psychological safety where people aren't scared to share an idea that might not come to fruition. I keep saying ideas, because it's just the easiest thing for us to use as context for this particular topic, but it can be a number of things. It could be coming up with, a new project, or executing a particular, for us, I can only think of marketing ideas, but trying something different with the marketing dollars that we have and knowing that it may not work. And one of the things that, we've been able to not only do here at DMA, but on behalf of our clients, is when we've created a space to where we're going to show up with our monthly reporting, and we're going to say, and this is kind of a mixture of, actually I'm going to tie it into the third one because I think it makes more sense there. But the third thing that I've learned through this whole journey is to focus on learning versus outcomes. And, when we're always focused on the outcomes, did we make our sales numbers? What didn't or did we not make, just in general? The riskier it feels to try something different because we're constantly focused on the outcome. But if we can include and or focus more on the learnings, like what lessons did we learn, then it creates an environment of curiosity and encouragement. And quite frankly, it encourages more experimentation, which leads, as we all know, to more innovation and more creative thinking. And so what I was going to say earlier to kind of finish that thought is, if you think about all three of these things and the way that, to give an example on how we've applied it at DMA, is that we provide monthly analysis reports or analytical reports to our clients, and they're very robust, and there's a lot of outcomes in there. We're being paid to produce outcomes, marketing outcomes that eventually create sales outcomes for our clients. We include entire sections on lessons we learned, things we didn't get right. Mm-hmm. So that's built into, so not only are we practicing that as a healthy culture around here to be better as a company and a unit and as a group, we are also inviting that exact type of vulnerability and risk. Look, client, we took a risk this month on changing up our ad strategy. This part worked, and you know what? These three things did not. And here's what we're going to try next time. So we're walking the walk both inside of our organization and on behalf of the brands that we work with. And I think that's critically important. And I remember a time in our journey as a company that I was so fearful of exposing things that didn't work.
Right.
To the point to where if it didn't work, we wouldn't even bill the client for it.
Right.
The time or the expense, because, we weren't willing to have the conversation up front of, hey, we're going to try some different things and some of them may not work. But now we have the confidence as a company to be able to have those conversations. So those are the three things: create a sandbox or some clear boundaries on what we can, where risk can and vulnerability can reside, make a safe, psychologically safe environment for things to go well, for things not to go well, and focus on learning versus outcomes. Focus on more learnings, not just solely outcomes.
And really, it starts with an assessment of oneself and where am I in this, on this vulnerability journey? Am I just getting started? Am I comfortable? Am I uncomfortable? And then what am I in on a daily basis in my environment, whether at work, whether, like you've said, you could be a leader at church, you could be a leader in the workplace, you could be a leader in your home. What's going on from a vulnerability standpoint in this community that I'm a part of? And the truth is, what I'm relating to is, I'm sure folks are listening to this and thinking, well, that's great. That works out at DMA. You're clearly a good leader, a great leader, and recognize these things and this need for emotional improvement relative to vulnerability. But what if I work for an organization where I'm one of many? I'm one of thousands potentially. And I don't feel empowered, or at least I'm not learning from my leadership that this is something that we're going to do here. So how do they move the needle on getting over that hump? What is the step? What are the steps? What's the first step? Just anything you can provide to help them go, to move.
I think all these podcasts, all of the content on the podcast that we have shared and will continue to share, I see everything that we're talking about as being something that starts with oneself. I don't know how to see it any other way.
Right.
If you want to be part of an organization where there's a lot more vulnerability in terms of how people are showing up, then the work starts with you. And it doesn't matter if you're one of 1,000. It doesn't matter if you're in a quote unquote designated leadership. We talk about it. Leadership is a designation that you make. It shouldn't be garnered because of your title or an anointment. You can decide to be a leader when you decide to be a leader. And so I think first start with, how are you dealing with vulnerability? How are you showing up with the knowledge of your own self and how to apply that with others? And so that could be with a colleague. It could be with a coworker. There doesn't have to be a reporting structure for you to begin to work on showing up as a more vulnerable person. Therefore, creating an opportunity to build trust and showing up in a way that creates a more positive outcome for you. If we said vulnerability ultimately leads to success.
Right.
And so I think that it has to start with you. And I do believe, and I know a lot of folks, I think you came from an organization where you felt like you
were a number.
You were a number, your words, not mine. And I think of that. I think a lot of people feel that way. And I think, again, starting with yourself and then attempting to find ways, especially if you believe in the company and the product. If you truly believe in what you're doing in an organization and you know that there's tenets of goodness in the culture, then be vulnerable enough to try to evoke the change that needs to be made. And that's a whole, there's a lot of ways to approach that, and that would be a whole nother episode of,
right.
How to speak up in the workplace, and maybe that will be something that we talk about. But I do think that be vulnerable enough to share your ideas and come up with solutions on how some of the steps could be taken, particularly in the organization. And then ultimately, if you're in an organization where you don't feel great about the products, you don't feel great about the service, and leadership is not anywhere near on a track towards being more, quite frankly, human, what we're talking about in these episodes is being a better human at the end of the day, then you have a decision to make. And that could be a church, a sports team. Yeah. It doesn't have to just be the workplace, but I think it's at some point you're going to have a difficult decision to potentially make. And I talk about that in episode 1. I talk about when I understood what culture was, or I think in episodes 1 or 2, I knew that the corporation that I ended up working for, because they bought out the family business, was not for me. And I did try to do some things to change some things. And I was vulnerable with some of my actions. And ultimately I had to make the decision that wasn't the place for me. And I hope that's not the case for most listeners out there, because I do think there's a lot of opportunity to, especially in this day and age with so much awareness and so many tools available, that there is an opportunity to use your vulnerability and your own self-awareness to show up for an organization that could potentially create sizable change.
Mm-hmm. And there you have it. That's vulnerability in a nutshell. You get to decide, listener.
That's right.
I think that's the key here, is that vulnerability is on you. And however you utilize it, whether it's to make change within an organization, make change within a group, your home, your family, it is on you.
It is. It starts with you. Mm-hmm. I mean, it definitely starts with you.
Mm-hmm. And it's a choice.
It is.
Okay. With that, shall we move to music?
Yes.
Our music moment.
Yes.
Speaking of vulnerable, let's talk about one of your favorite topics.
Okay.
Okay. I would have to say that while you admit that being vulnerable isn't easy,
it's not.
It's not. I have watched you hundreds of times doing something quite vulnerable, I think, when you get up on a stage and you sing karaoke.
Okay. Definitely one of my favorite topics. So, yay.
Yes, because, and here's why. Here's the deal. You know this. I've told you this 100 times too. For every time that you've performed, I follow this up. You're a beautiful performer, an entertainer.
Okay.
You'd win Entertainer of the Year.
Yes, I have in my head a lot. I've accepted that award a lot.
A lot, right?
A lot. I've been up there on that stage accepting the award, yes.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
In my little mind.
However, the radio voice, this DJ voice, doesn't always translate over into a perfectly pitched singing voice.
No, tone challenged for sure.
Tone challenged. And so would you talk to us a little bit about knowing that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then showing up and performing like hell anyway.
Yeah, it's funny now that I think about I do think that there's a parallel to the 26% approval rating, and then my journey to realizing that I probably should also pick up the school books along with the microphone. And, my earliest memory, and again, all of you know, if you've been listening, that I'm turning 50 actually within a month as of this recording. And my earliest memory of performing in front of a large group, my mother worked for this company, and they would have this large picnic out in the country. And I mean, the band would come in, and I mean, it was hundreds of people. And so it'd be like I said, I don't know, like a 5-piece, 7-piece country western band.
Yeah, a good size.
Yes, and so my parents loved to tell the story about how they were in 2 different places. I mean, this is like a huge, I don't know if it was an event space or someone's ranch. I don't know, but it was large. And they both talk about how they were in different spaces, and the kids were all running around. We were in a safe place, so the kids didn't need to be, in any particular area. And so they're talking. My dad says he can actively remember the beginning of the song 9 to 5. And
like
so
he's standing talking to
so-and-so, yes. And so he hears 9 to 5, and he thinks in his mind in that moment, Danelle's going to be so excited, being the young, at that time, Dolly Parton fan. Well, in the moment's notice, so after the opening, and we all know the clicking, that she does on her fingernails, out comes this little voice, or big voice for a little person, because I was 9 years old, and I sing the whole song with the band. all 9 to 5, and the place just erupts, and I'm fed by that energy. So
Yes.
that was the first time. Now I've been singing way before that, but in that moment, and that, again, that random ranch we were at that day, I convinced this band without my parents even knowing to let me get up there and sing. And then the audience's reaction fed what would become now a 40-year journey of singing and performing. And then the funny story about that is that the next year the band and the company invited me back to sing. And so in my sophomore year
bless 'em.
performance, I know, it's so sweet, showed up with my satin shirt on with fringe on it. And I'll never forget, I sang the song Nobody by Sylvia, which I know you know because we've
Yes,
sang
I
it
do.
many times late at night on our travels, but not the most appropriate song in the world for a child to sing. But I was 10 years old at that point, and that's when my dad pulled me aside and said he really got worried because he's like, you got lightning focus. And my dad is an incredible, he hears music, so it just comes naturally for him. So he didn't know how to articulate that. I don't know how to teach you how to sing better, but you need to pick up the books. And so I think I had one of those awakening moments. But yeah, love to sing, and I knew in that moment that my dad's vulnerable moment of having to express to me that I might need to also study at school, besides just show up and probably sing for people, that in that moment I decided that, well, I was never going to quit singing, and I haven't all these years later. So
it's a courage, it's vulnerability, this is fun for me and this fills me up with joy. I don't care how my voice sounds. And I think everybody knows that, by the way.
Right.
Because everyone can see when you're in the moment. And she goes all out. Like, she has a karaoke stage in our home.
yes,
Like, this is a whole thing. And
we have a karaoke lounge that has an incredible stage. So I just want to be clear that it's not just a stage randomly in the house. Like, there's a
it's
lounge.
the karaoke lounge.
Yes.
And it's a place where memories have been made.
For 18 years.
18 years. It's a wonderful place to be, and it's a wonderful time. And I've never walked away from a karaoke experience with you where anybody said, wow, that was really terrible. Everybody says, wow, that was really awesome, because she's got so much energy and joy. And so it is a joy to watch you karaoke, no matter how your voice sounds, even though I think, as you've continued to practice, you sound pretty good.
Well, thanks. I think I'm getting better.
I think you are.
It's getting better. I mean, again, 40 years later, we're still on the journey. But yeah, there's vulnerability shows up in different ways. And there's the whole point I'm thinking of you bringing this up is how to overcome it and how to live through it and live with it. It's something that when you learn, roll with it, when you learn to live with it, because I wouldn't say that because I like to do it doesn't mean that each instance doesn't present itself with a possibility of a different environment or an audience that might not cheer. And
Sure.
I just learned through the years that it's still worth doing it, even if I
is.
get a boot every once in a while or a very quiet audience sometimes if I'm, don't have my people around.
Well, thank you for doing it, because it certainly brings many of us joy, and I know it brings you joy, and we all love it. And, when you've been brought up to the stage to either sing or dance alongside you, it's just so much fun. So thank you for your vulnerable moments on stages.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that brings us to a wrap. Is there anything we want to mention before we go?
For sure. Can't say it enough. We're show notes are something that we care deeply about. And I know a lot of you are reaching out, thanking us for the amount of content that we're putting in there. And we want this as a conversation style podcast. We want this to be more conversational, but we also want there to be tools for you to use. We've spent many of years collecting this information and honing it so that it's digestible and it becomes more actionable for you quicker than it was for us. And so show notes, that's on our website itself. Is it the? Just Self Smarter Podcast.
Yep.
So .com, obviously. And so definitely check that out. And then also I want to thank everyone again. The reviews continue to come in on Apple Podcast and on Spotify, or more ratings, but just appreciate the more ratings and reviews that we are able to obtain. That means more people are going to find our show, this podcast. And again, I think if you've been listening at all, we're really trying to help, and that's what we're after here. So it's not the amount of people that are showing up and listening, it's the amount of people that we're helping. So thank you. And again, for helping us do that.
Yep.
So.
And next episode, you talked about it earlier. You kind of did a little spoiler alert, which I appreciated. We are going to be talking about people's fear of conflict. So tough conversations and getting sort of over that fear and how we manage it together. So join us for that next week. That'll be a big topic. And otherwise, we send you into the week with grateful hearts.
All right. Thank you, everyone. As always, you can connect with us on Instagram and Facebook at Self Smarter Podcast. You can also leave a rating or review if you enjoyed what you heard today. Not only does this mean so much to us, but it also helps other leaders and future leaders find our community. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us in becoming Self Smarter. This podcast is produced by Snacks Media, and music is from a free platform. Well, that is until Brandy Carlisle reaches out to us to write the original score for our podcast. Friends, have a great rest of your day.